Anna Lindstrom was 22 years old when her husband's family made it clear she was no longer welcome on their Minnesota Territory farm. It was August 1867, and Eric Lindstrom, Anna's husband of 3 years, had died in June from injuries sustained when his horse threw him and he struck his head on a rock. Eric's father, Lars Lindstrom, had inherited the farm back from Eric's estate, and Lars's new wife had no interest in supporting a childless daughter-in-law who represented Eric's first wife's family line. Anna's parents had died in the severe winter of 1863 when she was 18. She'd married Eric that same year, a practical arrangement that gave her security and gave Eric a wife who understood farm work. They'd been building a life together. Then a spooked horse ended everything. Lars gave Anna until September 1st to find other arrangements, offered her $35, Eric's savings, and suggested she move to St. Paul, where single women could find work. The farm would stay with the Lindstrom family. Anna would have to build her own future. Anna took the $35 and made a choice that would revolutionize how her Minnesota community understood heating systems and prove that the warmest houses sometimes have no chimneys and no stoves. She'd claim unclaimed land 5 miles from the Lindstrom farm and build a cabin. But she faced an immediate problem: heating. Minnesota Territory winters were deadly. Temperatures dropping to -30 degrees, sustained cold that could kill anyone without adequate shelter. Conventional heating required a cast-iron stove costing $15 to $20 plus chimney construction. With only $35 total, she couldn't afford both shelter and conventional heating. But Anna remembered something from her childhood on her parents' farm: the manure pile. On cold winter mornings, she'd seen steam rising from the center of the composting manure and bedding straw. Her father had explained, decomposition generates heat. Bacteria breaking down organic matter release energy as heat. A large enough compost pile could stay hot, sometimes 130 to 160 degrees at the center, even in the coldest weather. What if she could harness that biological heat for her cabin? Build a composting chamber as part of the structure itself, using the heat of decomposition instead of combustion. It would require no chimney, no smoke to vent, would require no stove, no fuel to burn, just organic waste materials that were free and abundant. The concept was radical for human housing, but based on solid agricultural knowledge that every farmer understood. The challenge would be engineering it to work safely and effectively. She found unclaimed land, a quarter section that nobody wanted because it was poor soil and heavily wooded, filed a squatter's claim, had $35 to build shelter before Minnesota winter arrived in November. Her cabin design was unlike anything conventional. She'd build a small structure, 12 feet by 14 feet, with one wall being a massive composting chamber. The chamber would be 6 feet wide, 12 feet long, 6 feet high, built integral to the cabin structure, sharing one wall with the living space. The chamber would be framed with scavenged logs, lined with stacked stones to contain the composting material and transfer heat, filled with layers of horse manure, cow manure, straw, hay, and vegetable waste. The decomposition would generate heat continuously. That heat would radiate through the stone wall into the cabin's living space. She began construction in early September, bought basic tools with $15, a good axe, a handsaw, a hammer, nails. Had $20 remaining for anything else needed. The cabin frame went up first. She cut logs from the heavily wooded property, small diameter trees maybe 6 to 8 inches thick, notched them for corner joints, built a rectangular structure 12 feet by 14 feet, walls 7 feet high. Roof was simple rafters covered with bark and sod. The critical innovation was the composting chamber, and building it correctly would determine whether Anna survived Minnesota winter or froze to death in a failed experiment. She built it against the north wall of the cabin, the side that would face prevailing winter winds. The positioning was deliberate. The composting wall would be the coldest exterior wall. By making it the thickest, most thermally massive wall, she'd place maximum insulation exactly where it was most needed. The chamber was essentially a large contained bin, 6 feet wide, running the full width of the north wall, 12 feet long, matching the cabin length, 6 feet high, matching the wall height. The total volume was 432 cubic feet, enough space for approximately 6 to 7 tons of composting material. The construction was methodical and technically demanding. She started with the frame, vertical posts every 4 feet, horizontal bracing creating structural grid. The exterior wall, north-facing, was log construction matching the rest of the cabin, 6-inch diameter logs chinked with moss and clay. The interior wall, the critical heat transfer surface between composting chamber and living space, was entirely dry stacked stone. She'd gathered field stones for 2 weeks, selecting pieces carefully. Wanted stones that were roughly flat so they'd stack stable without mortar. Collected approximately 2 tons of stone, limestone and granite fieldstone ranging from fist-sized to 50-pound pieces. The dry stack construction required skill and patience. She'd select each stone for how it fit with surrounding stones, test stability, adjust placement, build layer by layer, ensuring no large gaps where composting material could escape. The wall grew slowly, maybe 1 foot of height per day of sustained work. The finished stone wall was 2 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly to 18 inches at the top. The thickness served multiple purposes, provided massive thermal mass for heat storage and transfer, prevented any composting material from entering living space, created structural support for the cabin wall, and established effective barrier while allowing heat conduction. The stone mass was approximately 3 tons, 3,000 pounds of limestone and granite that would absorb heat from composting material on one side and radiate it into the living space on the other side. The thermal lag, time for heat to conduct through 2 feet of stone, meant the interior surface temperature would be stable and consistent even if composting activity fluctuated. For ventilation, absolutely critical for aerobic decomposition, she created deliberate gaps. At the base of the exterior chamber wall, she left 6-inch gaps between logs in 3 locations. At the top, similar gaps. These openings allowed air circulation. Fresh oxygen would enter through bottom gaps, rise through the composting mass as it warmed, exit through top gaps. The natural convection would maintain aerobic conditions. The chamber door, exterior access for adding material and removing finished compost, was constructed from thick planks, 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, hinged with leather straps and wooden pins. The door needed to seal adequately to prevent heat loss, but open easily for regular maintenance access. By late September, the structure was complete. A small cabin with living space 12 feet by 8 feet. The composting chamber occupied the other 6 feet of width. No chimney visible anywhere. No stovepipe, just a log cabin with unusual thick north wall. Now came the critical test, filling the composting chamber and achieving stable heat generation through controlled biological processes. She needed large quantities of specific organic materials in correct proportions. The science of composting, though not formally understood in 1867, was practical knowledge every farmer possessed from managing manure piles and observing natural decomposition. She needed 2 types of materials: nitrogen-rich greens, fresh manure, fresh plant material, and carbon-rich browns, straw, hay, dead leaves, wood shavings. The ratio was critical. Too much nitrogen created ammonia smells and heat loss through volatilization. Too much carbon-starved bacteria of nitrogen needed for protein synthesis, slowing decomposition and heat generation. The optimal ratio was roughly 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen by weight. She visited neighboring farms requesting manure and spoiled fodder, Most farmers were enthusiastic. Anna was offering to haul away waste they'd have to manage anyway. She'd load a borrowed cart with perhaps 500 pounds of material per trip, haul it 5 miles to her property, fork it into the composting chamber, make the trip again the next day, and again. Over 3 weeks in late September, she made approximately 30 trips. Transported perhaps 15,000 pounds, 7.5 tons, of composting material. Her back ached constantly from the forking and hauling. Her hands developed new calluses specific to pitchfork grips, but the chamber gradually filled. The layering was methodical and technically precise. She'd spread a 6-inch layer of straw across the chamber floor. The straw provided carbon and created air spaces for oxygen circulation. Then 3 inches of fresh horse manure, high in nitrogen, high in moisture, high in thermophilic bacteria. Then 6 inches of hay. Then 3 inches of cow manure. Then 6 inches of dead leaves. Then 3 inches of chicken manure, the highest nitrogen content. Repeat the pattern upward. Each layer was moistened carefully. She'd haul water from the creek, pour it over each layer using a bucket. The material needed to be as wet as a wrung-out sponge, maybe 50 to 60% moisture content. Too dry and bacterial activity would cease. Too wet and air couldn't circulate, forcing anaerobic conditions. The moisture balance was critical. By early October, the chamber was filled to 5 feet depth, about 360 cubic feet of material. She'd deliberately left 1 foot of space at the top for material expansion as it heated and for adding fresh material later. The total mass was approximately 6 tons of carefully layered organic matter. The biological process began immediately. Mesophilic bacteria, bacteria that function at moderate temperatures, started decomposing the readily available sugars and proteins. This initial phase generated moderate heat, warming the mass from ambient temperature to perhaps 90 to 100 degrees within 48 hours. As temperature rose, thermophilic bacteria, heat-loving bacteria that thrive at 120 to 160 degrees, became dominant. These bacteria could break down more complex compounds, including cellulose and lignin. Their metabolism was highly exothermic. The heat generation accelerated dramatically. Within 3 days, Anna could feel warmth radiating from the stone wall. The surface temperature on the living space side was perhaps 70 degrees, noticeably warm to touch. Within a week, the wall in certain spots was too hot to keep her hand pressed against for more than a few seconds, probably 100 to 110 degrees at the warmest points. The physics was working exactly as predicted. At the core of the composting mass, the center of the 6-ton pile where insulation was maximum, temperature was likely reaching 140 to 160 degrees. Thermophilic bacteria were operating at peak efficiency. The decomposition was generating perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 BTU per day, equivalent to burning 4 or 5 pounds of wood, but without combustion, without smoke, without fuel cost. The heat conducted outward through the composting material into the stone wall's exterior surface, through 2 feet of thermal mass, and radiated from the interior surface into the living space. The stone acted as both barrier and heat exchanger, slow to heat up but slow to cool down, providing stable, consistent warmth. The cabin maintained remarkable temperature. Outside temperature in October ranged from 60 degrees during day to 30 degrees at night. Inside the cabin with no fire, just the composting wall, temperature stayed around 55 to 60 degrees constantly. The biological heating was working. For cooking and additional warmth, she built a small outdoor fire pit, used minimal wood just for meal preparation. The composting wall provided baseline heating. The fire pit handled cooking needs without requiring a chimney. The town's reaction when neighbors discovered her living situation was immediate skepticism and mockery. Anna Lindstrom was living in a cabin with no chimney, no stove, claiming to stay warm from a pile of manure in the wall. It was the most ridiculous thing anyone in Minnesota Territory had heard. Martha Henderson, wife of a successful farmer, organized a visit in late October. 5 women came to see this absurd manure cabin and convince Anna to accept proper housing. They arrived and stopped, staring at the cabin. No chimney visible, no stovepipe, just a small log structure with one wall significantly thicker than normal. They entered through the door and stopped again, confused by what they felt. Warm air, not blazing hot, maybe 60 degrees, but noticeably warm despite no visible heat source. No stove, no fireplace, just one wall that radiated gentle heat when you stood near it. "Anna, dear," Martha said carefully, "you have no stove, no chimney. How are you staying warm? And what is that wall?" "The wall is a composting chamber, filled with manure, straw, and hay. Bacterial decomposition generates heat, same process that makes manure piles steam in winter. The heat radiates through the stone wall into the living space. It's biological heating instead of combustion heating. You're heating your house with manure. Manure. That's not heating. That's madness. When Minnesota winter comes, real winter, minus 30 degrees, you'll freeze. Please accept the Morrison family's offer, room and board plus wages, proper housing with proper heating." Anna thanked them for their concern and watched them leave, certain they'd return in January to collect her frozen corpse. Through November, the composting wall continued performing beyond Anna's initial expectations, and she developed sophisticated understanding of the system's maintenance requirements and operational characteristics. The chamber required regular attention to maintain optimal heat generation. Every 10 to 14 days, she'd add fresh material through the exterior access door, would fork in perhaps 200 pounds of new manure and straw on top of the existing pile. The fresh material would begin decomposing immediately, generating new heat to replace the gradually cooling older material below. The older material, now months into decomposition, was cooling as readily available nutrients were depleted, but it still provided thermal mass and insulation for the hotter core above. Eventually, perhaps in spring, she'd need to remove the bottom layers of finished compost, valuable fertilizer for gardens, and refill from the top, maintaining the cycle. The temperature gradient within the chamber was fascinating to observe through careful measurement. She'd insert a metal rod through the exterior door at different depths, leave it for several minutes, withdraw it, and feel the temperature. At the surface, top few inches, maybe 80 degrees where fresh material was just beginning to heat. At 1 foot depth, 120 degrees where active thermophilic decomposition was occurring. At 2 feet depth, 150 to 160 degrees at the peak temperature zone. At 4 feet depth, 90 degrees where older material was cooling. At 5 feet bottom, perhaps 70 degrees where material was nearly finished composting. The stone wall interior surface temperature varied by location. Near the top, where the hottest composting was occurring, 100 degrees. At mid-height, 95 degrees. Near the bottom, 80 degrees. The varying temperatures created gentle convection currents in the cabin air, warm air rising near the top of the wall, cooler air descending near the bottom, creating natural circulation that distributed heat throughout the small living space. December brought real cold that tested the system's performance limits. Temperature dropped to 0 degrees at night, minus 10 degrees during sustained cold snaps. The cabin maintained 55 degrees baseline, the composting wall generating enough heat to keep interior temperature 55 degrees warmer than the minus 10 exterior. That temperature difference represented continuous heat generation of perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 BTU daily. Her neighbors burning wood were struggling. The Henderson farm was consuming 3/4 of a cord weekly, approximately $35 worth of fuel per month at commercial rates. Anna was consuming 0 fuel for heating. The economic difference was staggering. Over a Minnesota winter, conventional heating might cost $60 to $80 in wood. Her composting heating cost nothing except labor to gather and transport waste materials. Then January brought the blizzard that proved everything and revealed to her community what biological heating could accomplish when conventional systems failed. The warning signs began January 8th evening. Temperature dropped from 10 degrees at noon to -10 by 6 p.m. to -20 by midnight. Barometric pressure was falling rapidly. Veteran Minnesota settlers recognized the pattern, Arctic outbreak arriving, bringing sustained, deadly cold. The storm hit January 9th dawn with apocalyptic fury. Temperature -30 degrees by 6 a.m., -35 by noon. Wind built to sustained 70 miles per hour, screaming gale that drove wind chill to -70 or colder. Snow fell at 5 to 6 inches per hour. Visibility dropped to 0 by mid-morning. The world became white chaos. Anna was in her cabin when the storm hit, had spent January 8th preparing, bringing in extra water, ensuring she had food supplies accessible, checking that the composting chamber exterior door was sealed against wind infiltration. Settled in for what she knew would be days of being housebound. By noon, January 9th, the storm was at full intensity. She could hear wind roaring outside, muffled by the log walls but unmistakably violent. Could hear snow pelting the walls with continuous sound like thrown sand. Could feel the whole structure shuddering slightly under wind pressure. But inside, protected by thick log walls and the massive composting chamber on the windward north side, temperature held steady at 52 to 54 degrees. The composting wall was unaffected by the external storm. The biological processes deep in the 6-ton mass continued unchanged. Thermophilic bacteria didn't care about -35 wind. They operated based on internal conditions, moisture, oxygen, available nutrients. All those conditions remained optimal. The heat generation continued steady. Anna wore extra layers, 2 dresses, wool shawl, thick stockings, and was adequately comfortable. Would do exercises periodically, jumping jacks, squats, to generate body heat and prevent stiffness from inactivity. Read by candlelight. Worked on sewing projects. Maintained calm routine despite knowing that outside conditions were deadly. The Henderson farmhouse, 1 mile away, was failing catastrophically by evening January 9th. Despite burning wood continuously in both the parlor stove and kitchen stove, interior temperature was 52 degrees. They were burning wood faster than they'd ever burned it, consuming perhaps 100 pounds per hour, depleting their wood supply at terrifying rates. But the -35 cold with 70-mile-per-hour wind was overwhelming their heating capacity. By midnight, 48 degrees inside despite maximum burning. The wood consumption was impossible to sustain. They had perhaps 3 days of accessible wood remaining at current burn rate. After that, they'd be burning furniture, floorboards, anything combustible, then nothing, then death. By day 3, Martha Henderson was showing hypothermia symptoms. Their house was 43 degrees despite maximum burning. They were out of accessible firewood, couldn't reach the outdoor woodpile through the blizzard, were burning furniture, were dying slowly despite being indoors. Her husband Robert made desperate decision on day 4. He'd walk the mile to Anna's cabin and beg for shelter. The manure cabin everyone mocked had to be better than the failing conventional house. He fought through the blizzard, nearly died making the 1-mile journey, arrived at Anna's cabin, frost-covered and hypothermic, knocked desperately on the door. Anna opened it. Warm air rolled out, 54 degrees meeting -35, creating visible vapor. Robert stumbled inside and collapsed. "My house is failing," he gasped when he could speak. 40 degrees inside despite burning everything. Martha is hypothermic. Can we shelter here, please? Anna could have refused, could have pointed out the months of mockery, could have let them suffer consequences of their dismissal. Instead, she sent him back with instructions. Bring Martha and anyone else who needs shelter. The cabin is small but warm enough for several people. Hurry." Robert returned with Martha, their 2 adult children, and elderly neighbor couple, 6 people total, all frost-covered, hypothermic, desperate. They entered Anna's tiny cabin and stopped completely, shocked by what they felt. Warmth, genuine warmth. Maybe 54 degrees, not hot but warm after days in failing houses. And no fire burning, no stove, just the mysterious warm wall that radiated steady heat. 6 people crowded into Anna's 12-by-8 living space, impossibly cramped. But everyone survived comfortably. The composting wall maintained temperature. The combined body heat of 7 people raised cabin temperature to 58 degrees. They were warm, while conventional houses throughout the territory were failing. Robert Henderson stood near the warm wall, still trying to process what was happening. How is this wall warm? There's no fire, no combustion. How does manure generate heat? Anna explained patiently. The bacterial decomposition process. The exothermic reaction releasing energy, the thermophilic bacteria functioning at high temperatures, the continuous heat generation that required no fuel, no combustion, no chimney. The agricultural knowledge farmers had always known about composting piles, now engineered for human housing. You're using controlled decomposition as a heat source, biological heating. That's brilliant. Why doesn't everyone do this? Because it requires understanding bacterial processes, careful material balance, regular maintenance, and overcoming the instinct that heat must come from fire. Most people can't imagine heating without combustion, but biological processes generate enormous heat. We just usually waste it. For 5 days, 7 people sheltered in Anna's cabin while the blizzard raged. The composting wall never faltered. The heat remained constant. Everyone survived comfortably, while conventional houses throughout Minnesota Territory failed catastrophically. When the blizzard ended January 14th, they emerged to find the landscape transformed. Multiple houses had interior temperatures below freezing. 3 families had burned all accessible wood and were burning possessions. 2 elderly people had died from hypothermia in their own homes, their conventional heating systems unable to protect them. Robert Henderson stood outside Anna's cabin, looking at the structure everyone had mocked. No chimney, no stove, just a composting wall that had outperformed every conventional heating system in the territory. The widow they'd pitied had built something superior to all their expensive stoves and chimneys. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "We mocked you, called your cabin madness, assumed you'd die. Instead, you saved us. Built heating that works better than ours using free materials. You're smarter than any of us understood." Anna could have been vindictive. Instead, she was practical and generous. "I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. The principles are simple, just agricultural knowledge applied differently. Composting generates heat. Control the process, and you control the heating. No fuel costs, no chimney needed, just maintenance and material rotation." By spring 1868, 6 families had asked Anna to consult on building composting heating systems. She'd explain the chamber design, the material ratios, the ventilation requirements, the maintenance schedule. At 22, she became the expert on biological heating, revolutionary for human housing, though farmers had understood the principles for generations. The adoption was rapid. By winter 1868-69, 12 homes in the territory had composting heating chambers. All performed remarkably, baseline temperatures of 50 to 55 degrees with 0 fuel consumption. Families would supplement with small fires for additional warmth, but the composting chambers eliminated 70 to 80% of winter heating fuel costs. Anna lived in her cabin for 6 years. Married at 28, a veterinarian who understood biological processes and appreciated her engineering. They built larger house but incorporated composting heating principles. Had 3 children. Anna became consulting engineer for agricultural heating systems, writing articles about biological heat generation that were published in farming journals. She died in 1918 at age 73. Her obituary mentioned her pioneering work with composting heating systems. The cabin everyone mocked became acknowledged breakthrough in sustainable heating. The original cabin stood for 40 years before being dismantled. Modern analysis of composting heating confirms the physics. Active compost generates 130 to 160 degrees at core, sufficient heat for baseline temperature maintenance in insulated structures. The process is continuous as long as fresh material is added regularly. The story is about a widow who understood that heat doesn't require fire, who applied agricultural knowledge to human housing, who proved that biological processes can replace combustion, and whose manure wall saved lives when expensive conventional heating systems failed. Because sometimes the person with no chimney and no stove knows more about heating than people with elaborate systems. The composting wall everyone called madness was actually sophisticated engineering. And biological heat generation matters more than combustion when you understand the physics.